Well, if you have your Bibles and want to follow along tonight, we continue Joseph's story in Genesis chapter 39. We're going to be there momentarily. I want to briefly review some of what we talked about last week. We explored last week how favoritism had created a toxic environment in Joseph's family life. His upbringing, as a result, had its pitfalls. His father, Jacob, was a bit oblivious to the bad resentment that he had bred amongst Joseph's brothers, and it culminated in this horrific plot to sell him into slavery and then go tell his dad that he was dead. And what's interesting as you kind of chart this story of Joseph, what you don't see is you don't see that family dysfunction and that betrayal letting those circumstances defile somehow Joseph's future for himself. He did not allow himself to be someone who grew in bitterness. And yet, as we pick up the story, we're going to see him far from home. He's going to be in Egypt, and he began as a slave. And we're going to see, even in this very brief story tonight, that his integrity and his God-given abilities quickly set him apart. And in his darkest moments, God was clearly still at work in his life. He was working through Joseph's faithfulness to get him to a place where he could position him for a greater purpose. And what's beautiful is, as this story unfolds, we're going to see the button on the end being that all that was intended to harm him, God intended for good. Now, what we're going to see is that he's in a guy by the name of Potiphar's household, and he's going to face a much different test than we talked about last week. Last week, we kind of talked about our circumstances, people being resentful of us, or us finding ourselves in a dysfunctional family, those kinds of things. It's a little different test, as he's going to have to navigate a personal temptation that threatens to derail the future that God has for him. And again, I wanted to emphasize that he wasn't allowing the circumstances to make him bitter, which is a fabulous lesson for us to learn. He's going to refuse at this point to let momentary pleasures derail his character and his calling. It reminds me that despite my circumstances, even painful ones, those things don't determine my destiny. So like I said last week, just again by way of review, when we last saw Joseph, he was sold as a slave to a group of Midianite traders, and these traders weren't intending to use Joseph themselves, but they traveled far away to Egypt, where they put him up on the sales block for becoming a slave. And what we're going to see in just a minute is he was a strapping young man, and so he probably fetched a decent price. His servanthood was probably attractive to several people, but the highest bidder was a wealthy guy by the name of Potiphar. And as we open up these reports, this high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court named Potiphar buys him, and he has him working in his house. I'm not going to read it, but you can read verses 2 through 6 in Genesis 39 that talks about how God blessed everything that he put his hand to, and he succeeded, and he was thriving. And so Potiphar notices this, and he takes note, and he starts putting him in charge of more and more and more, until Joseph is basically in charge of the entire household of Potiphar. And he actually recognizes the providence of God in this, where he's like, Joseph's God must be with him. Everything he touches turns to gold. This is really great. And so he promotes him to become overseer of his household. Now, about 11 years passes between the time Joseph was walking around as a teenager out to meet his murderous brothers and this point in his life where he's been elevated to a point of favor and authority and luxury. And you can kind of feel good at this point because, hey, the tables have turned. Things aren't so bad. This is really good for Joseph. But there is this major temptation that is waiting for him right under Potiphar's nose. And we're going to read about it at the end of verse 6. Again, we're in Genesis chapter 39. Now, Joseph was well-built and handsome. That's a key part of this story, which, by the way, that's a really weird thing to read in the Bible. About any Bible character, being well-built. But it is relevant because he was not just good at his job, he was easy on the eyes. And this attracted some attention. Look at verse 7. After a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, quote, "Come to bed with me." So, this lady doesn't have a lot of game. Her strategy is, I will just command him to come and sleep with me. And look at verse 8. But he, meaning Joseph, refused. With me in charge, he told her. I love this little spiel he gives her. My master does not concern himself with anything in the house Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? I want to just pause and say, for a person of a different character, that speech could have started out the exact same way and ended much differently. Ended with a different sentence. Look at all that I'm in charge of. Everything in this house I command. I have all these responsibilities, and therefore, this seems like a fantastic idea. I have earned all of this. But that is not what he says. And so he says this, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Which is interesting. An interesting way of putting it. He says, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside, and she caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Now, I have to just kind of, again, let my mind wander to some of the potential rationalizations that Joseph could have used to, again, maybe have this turn out a little bit differently. For example, we already said, how did he end up in Potiphar's household? He is a servant. He is a slave. You are a slave, that means you don't get to be married. And if you don't get to be married, that means you're not having sexual relations with anyone. So you could have seen Joseph, again, a strapping young lad, having a rationalization that the only way I'm going to get to sleep with a woman is this opportunity right in front of me. He doesn't do that. You could also say, he's in charge of everything, right? He says that in his response. The master has put everything under my charge, meaning he could have commanded privacy. And no one would even have to know. He just commands that, hey, everyone clear out of the house. No one even knows what's up. Or he could have thought to himself, you know, she is my boss's wife. I probably need to stay in good graces with her. And so I better do what she says. I don't want to lose my job. Again, yes, thank you, Amina. This is how men think, Amina. But he doesn't do any of that. Instead, he just is responding in the most mature way possible. But again, I want you to notice this too. Mrs. Potiphar seems to intensify the temptation, because this isn't like a one-time solicitation. What it says there is she personally invited him every day. And you can almost imagine, again, her enticements, the way she let her hand linger on his, or put on a little extra perfume, or wore some immodest clothing, whoops, I dropped my towel situations, in order to try to entice him even more. Lust had clearly consumed her, and her goal was clearly Joseph, and she was doing everything she could, and it would be so easy to succumb to this just this once. It won't hurt anybody. And then there comes this day where Joseph walks in. It's really quiet in here. Why is it so quiet? There's no servants anywhere to be found. And he doesn't understand. And then all of a sudden, Potiphar's wife makes her boldest move yet. And she doesn't just ply him with words this time, which up to that point had been her primary strategy. Now she literally grabs a hold of him, and apparently grabs a hold of him so tightly that when he jerks away, his outer cloak is left in her hands, and he dashes out into the street. So that's the story in a nutshell. I want to draw some applications. I want to first put a fairly fine point on the applications related to sexual temptation specifically, but I also want to draw some other applications since those might not be relevant for everyone, and I want to make it relevant as possible. The first relevant application, when it specifically comes to the sexual temptation, is this one. Joseph did a marvelous job maximizing the consequences. He called it right, which is, again, I feel like when we get ourselves in trouble is when we do the opposite of that, when we minimize the possible consequences of sinful behavior. He says in verse 9, he calls what Mrs. Potiphar is doing, pardon me, a wicked thing and a sin against God. And so it's not just, I'm going to hurt my boss here, I'm going to break that trust and break that relationship. Excuse me. Max, will you go get me something to drink? He calls it, very importantly, a sin against God. There was a guy named Randy Alcorn, and he's written some books. You may know him. He met a man who had been a leader in a Christian organization. He had committed an immoral act, and Alcorn asked him, what could you have done to prevent this? This is in the aftermath. And the man paused, and he said, kind of with this haunting pain and this precision, he said, quote, "If only I had really known, really thought through and weighed what it would cost me and my family and my Lord, I honestly believe I would never have done it." I think a lot of people, when they succumb to temptation, they find themselves in that moment, right? Where you're realizing, I didn't really weigh the consequences. I wasn't really thinking about what potentially could be disastrous from the situation. And it is this idea of like there's going to be actual physical consequences potentially, but there's a shame and there's a guilt that's going to be very difficult to shake, for the rest of my life. But the truth is, I think this is what happens. We can sit here in this room, we're literally in church, and we're talking about these ideas, and we shake our heads and we agree here in this place. Easy to do. But the question is, are we going to think of temptation and the consequences, the maximized consequences, when someone is saying, come and lie with me, that you shouldn't be anywhere near? Will we maximize the consequences in our mind's eye before we jump in front of the bull? Joseph was very careful about what he exposed himself to. He didn't try to be polite about the issue either. I love the end of verse 10 where it says, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. It is the idea that he did not linger. And that's my next point. If you want to put that up, Barbara, thank you. Joseph didn't linger. And I want to pull over and park on this one in just a second. But he doesn't toy with sin at all. He doesn't see how close to the line he can get without going over. And again, let's strip this from the provocative sexual nature of this specific temptation and think of it more like this. How much can I talk about people who are not in the room before it's considered gossip? I mean, what I'm saying is true about them. Or how about this? How much can I envy my neighbor's car before that's like considering coveting my neighbor's car? Or how much do I have to take from the office before that's actually considered stealing? I mean, I use some staples. That's not stealing, is it? I make some copies. I take home a note. At what point, is that, how close to that? Do you see the difference between lingering, how close to the line can I get without going over, and what Joseph did, which is, I'm not going to sleep with you, and I'm literally not going to go anywhere near you. He's not seeing how close to the line he can get. He's keeping his distance from temptation. In fact, it literally says when things really start closing in, verse 12, he literally ran away from the moment. Again, I just want to be honest about myself and how temptation works. We justify tuning into tempting stuff at times. We sort of justify it in our heads. We flirt with sin thinking we're the master. We linger when we should be running. So, the question kind of becomes, what do we linger on? I want to come back to that point, but I want to move on to this lesson that we learned from Joseph, and that is Joseph could spot a counterfeit offer when he saw it. I know there are people that date online, maybe in this room, maybe not. It's more and more popular these days, by the way. But what's interesting is people aren't always truthful online when they're making their online dating profile, are they? So I wanted to unpack some of what you might read online. Like, for example, if someone says they're 40-ish, if they are a woman, that means she's 48. If it's a man, that means he's 52 or so, okay? That's 40-ish. How about this? They love a good conversation. Now, if that's a woman, that means that she is never going to stop talking. And if that's a man, that means he's a liar, okay? If they say they're emotionally secure, That means they're very highly medicated. Ladies, if he's huggable, that means that he is probably at least 40 pounds overweight and his back is probably hairier than a Wookiee. And men, if she's romantic, that just means she looks better by candlelight, all right? You laughed, okay, so that's fair. We shouldn't be fooled, but when it comes especially to sexual temptation, oftentimes we are. Joseph's not fooled. He's not fooled by the charms of this wealthy woman. He's not fooled by the things that she's doing or saying. He knew what was going on. James chapter 1, verse 14 and 15 talks about temptation. It says, each one of us, each person, is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. And then after the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. You may miss it in the English translation, but if you look at verse 14 of that text, there's language from sport fishing that's actually used there. The idea of a fisherman is going to use what is attractive to the fish. It's not going to actually be good, healthy food for the fish. It's going to appear to be good food for the fish. It promised this full satisfaction, and as soon as they take the bait, they're going to realize they've been fooled, it's been counterfeit, but it's too late for that. And I think in the same way, temptation is sometimes crafted to our own cravings, where we think to ourselves things like, my husband doesn't meet my needs like he could. If you really love me, it's okay. Who's ever going to find out? We're going to be married soon anyway. I'm only able to withstand so much loneliness. God understands. That's why He brought you into my life. What's grace all about if it won't cover something as natural as this? These are the thoughts of a 15-year-old couple on a couch, when their parents aren't home. But there also are thoughts, too, about sin sometimes, the way we justify it. In a matter of seconds, you're going to decide whether to act on temptation or resolutely reject it. And the moment you consent to the temptation, you consent to what the temptation offers, it's the moment that you misuse the God-given desire with willful intent, and sin is conceived. I like that idea, too, as sin is conceived, because it's like it starts out as this tiny thing, but it's been conceived, and it's just going to grow and grow and grow from there. All right, I want to make some kind of broader application points from this story before the thoughts will be yours. And I want to say the first one is this. We need to recognize the counterfeit offers in every area of our life. Joseph identified the counterfeit offer of Mrs. Potiphar, and I think we need discernment a lot of times. Like, for example, I'm going to cut corners. I'm at work, and I'm going to cut corners, and that's going to lead to faster advancement, and it's going to be a net positive for me. Or the idea that a little dishonesty on your taxes never hurt anybody. Or the belief that gossiping, that builds meaningful relationships. That's how we connect as we talk about people. Or the notion that accumulating possessions, that's going to somehow meet your deepest need. Each of those is really a counterfeit version of something God is actually wanting for us. Integrity and honesty, authentic community, contentment. It's offering us this fake version of that, almost like this shortcut version of that's not real. So we have to get better at recognizing counterfeit offers in our life. I feel like this is maybe something that we do get better at as we get a little bit older, that we recognize. I'm thinking about the preacher Kohelet in Ecclesiastes, where he's like, it's the Solomon idea. I tried this, and it was meaningless. I tried that, and it was meaningless. I tried this, and it was meaningless. You realize how many things are counterfeit, offering meaning. Here's another idea. Again, I've already mentioned this, but I want to drill down a little bit in a broader way. Don't linger in compromising situations. It goes so far beyond sexual temptation. Whenever anger threatens to just take over, the idea that you can step away to regain some perspective and that you're not going to make a decision while you are angry. Or when someone that you care about is pressuring you to make a decision that you recognize is not the decision you probably need to be making, to be willing to exit that situation. Or whenever envy begins taking root. This is a bit of an envy machine at times. Because I scroll social media and I see all of the wonderful ways God's blessing everybody else. And I think to myself, why can't that be me? That should be me. I deserve that to be me. And when that happens, what do I need to learn to do? That right there. Set it down and walk away. Or whenever the workplace culture that we're in, it pushes ethical boundaries. It's asking us to, again, be something that we're really not. We have to establish clear personal limits and boundaries. And this is who I am, and I will be uncompromising in this. It is the idea of running, but embracing the idea that running isn't always cowardice. It is sometimes wisdom that recognizes our own vulnerabilities. There's power in not lingering in compromising situations. As I already mentioned, again, maximizing the consequences of all of our choices. Again, something that happens when you get older is you realize how valuable your time is. And when you recognize how valuable time is, you spend it a little bit more wisely. How we spend our time and considering the long-term impacts of the habits that we have could be a powerful way that we face down temptations. Or financial decisions, thinking about weighing immediate wants versus future needs. Or words that we say in heated moments where we consider their lasting effects on relationships. We've all heard the analogy of not being able to put the toothpaste back in the tube. There's certain things that are so easy to say, and then we take the rest of our lives making the person convinced that we didn't really mean that thing. Or career choices, evaluating them against our larger calling and the values that we truly, truly believe. When tempted, we have to ask, if I project this decision forward 5 years, what's it going to cost? What does it cost me? What does it cost my family? What does it cost my witness for God? Another application here is remaining faithful regardless of fair treatment. Again, there could have been any excuse in the world that Joseph had. I've been betrayed by my family. I've been enslaved unjustly. I've been falsely accused. That's going to happen next week. And he's going to maintain his character over and over and over. He's not using all that as an excuse. And we have to learn to do that as well. And then finally, I want to say this. Trust God's unseen work in difficult seasons. Over and over and over again, what you're going to see is the stakes become very high for Joseph. Things become incredibly challenging. And yet he holds on to that vision that God had given him as a young person. He never loses sight of that. And our challenge might be kind of similar, where we develop patience that we're going to need for future responsibilities. We build empathy that's going to enable ministry to other people. We deepen our dependence on God when human supports fail. There's all kinds of other directions to go than right into temptation whenever things are really hard. When we maximize consequences, we're not just avoiding trouble, we're actively participating in God's greater purpose of our life. And even when that purpose remains partially hidden from our view, we still remain so.